I'm Anker Berg-Sonne. Kirsten is my wife. You probably know her better than me. Yeah, and we have been Stowe residents since 1978, which makes it 42 years, I believe.
Yes.
And we retired Kirsten retired eons ago. I retired about 5 years ago, and since then we've traveled extensively. And today I'll be talking about our recent trip in November to New Zealand. I have a bunch of slides. I can actually stop pretty much anywhere, and it speeds up at the end because then I've covered most of what I want to talk about. So what I'd like to encourage you to do is just ask questions. You know, if something comes up that you want me to go into depth with, just let me know. What I'll do is I'll first talk a little bit about what is New Zealand, and then I'll go into our trip and try to cover more about what New Zealand is and what our impressions were than exactly what we did. But we covered the entire island, and there was a lot to see. So, excuse me?
Both islands?
Yes. Oh, yes. Let me quickly explain that we lived in Australia for 2.5 years from 1983 to 1985. And I had multiple business trips to New Zealand, but only made it to the North Island, and almost all the time it was in Auckland. So I really didn't get to see New Zealand while we lived there, but I always wanted to see the rest of New Zealand. So the opportunity came up. The way we normally travel is we find a good deal, airfare, and then we plan the trip ourselves, which is what we did this time. So New Zealand, where is it? It's in the Southern Ocean. We've got the South Pacific Ocean on the right side. We've got what's called the Tasman Sea on the west or left side. And the Tasman Sea is the sea between the Australian mainland and New Zealand. New Zealand sticks down a little bit below Australia, and it sticks down into what's called the Roaring Forties, which is the Southern Ocean. And what's special about that part of the Southern Ocean is that there's really no landmass. So the weather and the winds become very, very strong, and cold and pretty bad weather. And a lot of the round the world yacht races where people drop out is in the Southern Ocean when the storms break the boats. It's on what's called the Ring of Fire, which is the rim around the Pacific Ocean where there's a lot of volcanic activity because of tectonic motion. So that's New Zealand, and that's called the Northern Island, and that's called the South Island for obvious reasons. So let me talk a little bit about the discovery of New Zealand. New Zealand was discovered by the Maoris, and they had a very, very interesting path getting there, because basically humanity traveled into the Pacific, and they went east from, people guessed from around Indonesia, and then they went to Samoa, and then they went into the south, the Society Islands, as they're called, where Tahiti is, and so on and so forth. And some of them migrated up to Hawaii, and some of them migrated down to New Zealand, and some of them actually went to Pitcairn Island, which is the most remote place on Earth. And all of this happened in the 1300s, so it's not that long ago. It was about 1,000 years after Christ that the first inhabitants, the Maoris, made it to New Zealand. So let me talk a little bit about how they made it, and that's just incredible, because what they did was they sailed there in these outrigger canoes. And they had their animals, they had the children, they had the food, they had all the water they needed, and how they knew that there was land where they were going just beats me. And the distances that they covered were just absolutely incredible. The whole migration into the South Pacific is just absolutely fascinating and something that's worth looking into. So what did they find? So they found this very, very strange country. Now, New Zealand separated from all other land before the emergence of mammals. So it was over 100 million years ago that New Zealand became isolated. So as a result, there are no mammals on New Zealand. Oh, there were no mammals when the Maoris got there, I have to say. The only animal they brought were rats. And the rats were food, they're basically their livestock. So one of the things what they found was that the niches that mammals occupy in the rest of the world were occupied by birds. So this is a cow, or the equivalent of a cow, the moa bird, an absolutely incredibly large bird. Now, and then there were medium-sized and little, the equivalents of sheep and goats, and then down to mice. So how about predators? The main predator was an absolutely massive eagle that actually attacked and ate these humongous moa birds. And I can imagine how scary it would have been to be one of the first people who came to New Zealand and saw one of these things. Now, unfortunately, people made quick business of all of these large animals. So the moas went extinct fairly quickly after people showed up. The eagles went extinct. Pretty much everything that could be hunted and eaten went extinct after the Maoris got there. And what's left, there's still some of these original birds, and everybody knows about the kiwi. So that's a kiwi, and that's a nocturnal animal. So that's basically what I have to say about the history of New Zealand. And now I'll talk about New Zealand as it exists today. Now, getting there, of course, is by airplane. And we travel coach. And traveling coach is miserable, especially on these long trips. But we found that New Zealand Air has this concept called a sky coach. And basically, instead of 2 seats, you buy 3 seats for a very reasonable upcharge, and you can configure the 3 seats as a bed. So basically, the footrest comes up completely level with the seat. And you get a thin mattress, and you get some real pillows. And if you're young, both of you can lie down and sleep. We don't. I can actually curl up enough that I can fit in 2 seats with Kirsten sitting next to me. When Kirsten uses the sky couch, it's a different story. So what we do is we just basically take, I think it was a 12 or 14-hour trip?
Yeah.
The 14-hour trip, so we took 7 hours each, roughly. And we really enamored with this concept. And in October, we'll be going to Australia, and we're going with Air New Zealand, and we're going to fly Sky Coach again. So if you're tempted by what I go through, Sky Coach is an option. So, Sky Couch. Yeah. So we landed in Auckland, and because we were flying Sky Couch, we were actually rested enough to be awake and not dog-tired, and we drove the first leg of our trip the same afternoon that we landed. And we drove to a place called Mata Mata. Now, a lot of the towns in New Zealand have Maori names. And I should just cover one more historical fact. In 1840, the Europeans had come along, and the British actually signed a treaty with the Maori where the Maori allowed the British to inhabit and live in New Zealand and colonize it. And it also gave the Maoris right. And this treaty is still in effect. And my observation, which hasn't been challenged, I actually asked somebody living in New Zealand to verify it, is that that has established one of the best relationships in existence between a indigenous population and the immigrant population. It didn't work out perfectly. The Maoris are a minority, and they typically are less wealthy and own less land. Unfortunately, what the British found out was they could buy land cheap, so they ended up buying pretty much all the land from the Maoris. And that's what has established the land ownership in New Zealand today. But overall, it seems very harmonious. Another thing that we quickly observed is that you don't see any homeless people in New Zealand at all. We didn't see a single homeless person in New Zealand, which is, I find, just wonderful. It means that society does take care of the underprivileged. They also do a couple of things that I find very sympathetic. They acknowledge that climate change is a problem that needs to be dealt with. They believe that you have to have income distribution, redistribution, and take care of the less fortunate in society, which is very appealing to me. So anyway, we arrived in Mata Mata, and we arrived early enough that we wondered, what are we going to do? So what we did was we drove out to Tauranga, which is a town on the Bay of Plenty. And sorry, I told somebody here where the volcano that exploded was, and I actually gave the wrong location. I now remember it's right here, White Island, and it's actually indicated right here. And if I had known about the volcano, I would have wanted to go there. But I didn't. Thank God. But Tauranga is actually a very charming town. On the way there, we drove through a very typical New Zealand landscape. It's like Ireland. Everything is green. There's no desert. Climate change is actually getting to dry out. And I'll try to remember to talk about that a little bit later. And most of the land that is flat enough is pasture. You see hardly any row crops. It's all pasture. And they have sheep and cattle and deer. And I'll talk about the deer later on this pasture. So we have this rolling green landscape with lots and lots and lots of grass. And I have another slide that shows that, but that's right at the end of the presentation. You see these lines on the hillside? They're made by the cattle and sheep as they walk sideways, so they always walk in the same spot. So the paths sort of become trodden down. So the landscape ends up with these ridges that go horizontally along the hillsides. I don't know. No questions? Huh? Okay. So there are also some strange things going on, and one of the things I found that was most fascinating is these tree ferns. So that's a fern, but it's about, I would say, 10 to 15 feet tall. And they are everywhere. So we saw our first tree ferns there. Whoops, sorry, I went one slide too far. So now we're down in Tauranga, and we saw the first Maori carvings in a park. So these are basic, I don't know what they signify. I believe that they are fairly close to being totem poles. There's a lady who looks like she wants to come in. Oh, she walked away. But I'm not sure about that. But I think they're equivalent to totem poles. So we spent the afternoon there, and then we drove back and went to bed. So the next trip was we didn't go a long distance from place to place, but we drove a long distance because what we did. This place is called Rotorua, again a Maori word, and that was our next evening stop. But we drove west to see two things. We went west to see Hobbiton. Do you know what Hobbiton is? It's the place where the Lord of the Rings movies and the Hobbit movies were taken. So, and what they have done is when they filmed The Hobbit, they preserved the whole set. And so you can actually see what you see on the movies, and they built it so that it would last. When they did The Lord of the Rings, it was all cardboard and foam and plastic. And of course it fell apart. After they tore it all down because it wouldn't last after the movie, but after The Hobbit, they decided to do that. And now you can go and see, but anyway, we're not there yet because here we are at a cafe in Matamata. The hotels down there don't serve breakfast. We found one that did, but in general, they don't serve breakfast. So you're on your own, and we discovered right away that they have fantastic cafes where you can eat both breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And so this is the first cafe in Matamata, and it's nice and warm, as you can see. This is October, which is equivalent to May here. But they were actually having a heat wave or a very warm spell at that time. And what we ate, I've forgotten what this thing is. This was Kirsten's breakfast. but it's basically egg and some kind of biscuit and bacon and cheese. And they have some word for it. I had a much more reasonable, I had eggs Benedict. I took a picture of every meal we had down there.
We saw them on Facebook.
Right. I'm not going to bore you with them today. So this is it. So here we are in Hobbiton. And we're getting ready to walk around Hobbiton, and they take you around in small groups. So you don't have a huge crowd. And you can just see the top, the mohawk of our tour guide right there. And here we have the Hobbit House. And here we, where the hobbits sat and played chess with each other. It's just, for me, it was just a beautiful, beautiful place. I loved it. I'm not a big fan of very touristy things, but I loved Hobbiton. I thought it was, and we had to go there because my oldest daughter's family are huge fans of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. So we had to go there, take a lot of pictures, and we also bought a couple of souvenirs for them. And here we have a hobbit. It's one of the things I did, which is so cute, is depending on who lived in each house. Of course, the hobbits weren't all small people in reality. So they built the house the right size to make the inhabitant look the right size. Now, they had a problem with Gandalf and Frodo, because Frodo is supposed to be a hobbit and Gandalf is supposed to be tall. and they were actually the same height. So they always had to use camera angles and props to make Frodo and Gandalf look the right sizes in the movie, which they did very well because, you know, I never got the clue that this is the case. So here we're looking over the lake in Hobbiton, and we have one of these absolutely fantastic pine trees that are scattered all over New Zealand. These are huge, huge pine trees, and they have absolutely incredible shapes. So here's one, you see another one over here. There's unfortunately one that's not going to last very long down there, but they're all over the island. And I was just mesmerized by these pine trees. Now, this tree is very special because it features prominently in the Hobbit books. And so this is an oak tree, so they had to, but there wasn't an oak tree on the set. So what they did, they made a fake oak tree. And so this one's completely fake. And each leaf is put on to the tree by hand, and it's made of silk. And it's painted in the right color. Unfortunately, when they first built it, the director came along and said that the leaves are the wrong color. So they had to repaint every leaf to make it look right. But so it's an incredible job. And whoops, I went the wrong way. Sorry about that. Here we have Gandalf's bitch with his pipe. Now we're down by the mill at the pond. And here we have a little break in the pub where I think Kirsten got a cider.
A ginger beer.
A ginger beer, yeah. And I got a cider, yeah. And our tour guide was the bartender, so.
I was wondering if they all had red hair.
No, they did not. But, and then an outside view of the pub. And, you know, you've seen them all in the movies if you looked at them. That's it. Now, we did go to what is called the Glowworm Caves. And they're a fantastic site. They have some caves where inside the caves they have worms that live on insects. And they live in the depth of the cave where it's pitch black. And to attract the insects, they have bioluminescence, which is white. And these, inside the cave, it looks like a starry sky, all covered with lights inside the cave. And we were expressly forbidden to take pictures inside the cave. I could have, but I didn't want to, be a rogue, because I didn't need to use a flash. But so unfortunately, there are no pictures there. And we also went to a bird center, and that's just a bunch of birds. So I skipped those when I assembled this. Oh, sorry, too fast. So the next day, we drove out to Gisborne, out on the coast, and that was sorry. Oh, I messed up. Rotorua, thank you. So we drove from Rotorua to Gisborne that day, right? And let me just explain that this road that we took is the best sports car driving road I've ever been on. It goes through a canyon, and it's windy, and there's no traffic, and we just had a blast.
What's the speed limit?
On the left side of the road, can you?
Of course. Yeah, let's say, yeah, so I was brought up, my first driving was on the left side of the road, and as I explained, we've lived in Australia, I've lived in Tanzania, so I'm used to driving on the left side of the road. The thing that bothers me is two things. The first day, I keep stepping into the passenger seat to drive the car, which doesn't work. The second, which bothered me the entire trip, is they switched the stalks. So the indicator's on the right, and the other one is on the left. So I kept turning the wipers on when I wanted to turn a corner, and I just could not get it completely right. It became less and less often, but I kept doing that. So
you learned to drive on the left?
Yes.
That explains a lot.
Thank you. I'm proud of that. So here we are in Rotorua, and we went to and we visited a culture center. That's what it's called. And inside the culture center, they basically had two things. They had Maori culture, which they talked about, and they had a show, which what I'm showing here is the greeting to everybody who's going in to see the show. And the house that they're in is built in traditional Maori style with lots of carvings. Very pretty, and they love that red color. You see that everywhere. And inside they showed traditional dances, and a lot of them had to do with flipping balls and twirling sticks and things like that, which they did very effectively. I won't embarrass Kirsten because she actually made it on stage, to my huge surprise, willingly. And she did one of those twirling the balls on a...
I see that. I've been waiting for it.
Well...
Right?
we should put it on Stowe TV so that everybody gets to see it. Now, I do have it here, but
Can I add something?
yes.
Because I can tell that since I was touching one of the balls,
Yeah.
it's not a ball. It's a white plastic bag, a shopping bag. Yes, that's all it is.
Oh,
Yeah.
so it's blank.
So they made it that way, and it's not that hard.
Yeah. So I only took very few pictures. If you hang around, I will show the video. So this was part of the show where they had a young couple who married out of love instead of arrangement, and he's showing the traditional dress. Now the Maoris originally had a lot of tattoos and face tattoos, and modern Maoris really do that. But we did see quite a few Maori women who had two black stripes down the chin, like a little beard that they had tattooed. But originally, the men would be completely covered with tattoos in the face and most of the body. And the other part of this cultural center was basically the hot springs. And unfortunately, we've been spoilt with what we have here in Yellowstone. This is not as impressive as Yellowstone, unfortunately, so we didn't spend a lot of time there. Instead, we jumped in the car and we drove off towards Gisborne. On the way there, we turned onto a side road which led down to the canyon, and we suddenly saw this fence, and these are all boots, children's boots. And painted in different colors. Now, I did learn that there are some displays of boots that are memorials from the kids who got shot in the mass shooting down in I can't remember the town right now. I don't know whether this is one of those, but I thought it was just amazing to see so many boots hung up. We saw several others that probably were memorials to the kids. But next to this was actually the fence by a parking lot, and at the parking lot, we did only stopped because we saw the boots, but it turns out that this is one of the last areas of true original forest as it existed in New Zealand. So Kirsten sat in the car, I went for a walk into the forest, very jungle-like, and in the middle of all that jungle, that have some huge trees that stuck up through the canopy, and they were actually the big pine trees that I was talking about before. So they would actually be sitting in the middle of a jungle instead of out in an open field. And on this picture, you can see here we have these trees sitting up there, and there was tons and tons of mistletoe on all of the trees, so you can see these clumps of mistletoe sitting on the trees. Just a beautiful sight. Oh, and that was the car we drove. Unfortunately, not a sports car. I would have preferred a Porsche, but we couldn't afford the rental. So it ended up being a Nissan. But I tried to drive it like a sports car. It was actually a nice car, to my surprise. So pretty much all the main roads in New Zealand are 2-lane. And the bridges, a lot of the bridges, are 1-lane. So you'd often come up to a bridge, and most bridges wouldn't have a stoplight. They would just have a sign telling you which direction had the right of way. So, and that could be pretty long. And I guess they save a lot of money by just making them 1-lane. So we had to have a picture of one of those. And this is a long one. Yeah. And often when you're on a fast road and a bridge was right around the corner, you really had to make sure that even if you had the right of way, that there wasn't somebody coming in the opposite direction. So you had to you couldn't just drive on and force them to back up all the way.
Were you able to see to the end there? I mean, I can't see an end. You could see the car coming though? I mean, that looks like a long distance to me.
Yeah, we could see the whole, but that was probably why they had a stoplight
Okay.
instead of who had to yield. Yeah, that was a long bridge. And after the gorge, we ended up on the coast, and I'm a tree person, so I've got to bore you with trees, but they had this fantastic tree cover right along the coast road that we drove through. And obviously had things in the wrong order. Here we had the gorge, and here you have a fantastic stand of really tall tree ferns.
Did they produce any?
I'm sorry?
Or anything? Did they produce anything?
No, I don't think so.
So they're not in the palm family at all?
No. It's like the ferns that you see in the forest, but they're only about that tall. They just,
It's a big giant one.
yeah. Another meal. So, my apologies. That's dinner in Gisborne. So after Gisborne, we drove to Taupo. And Taupo is very, very interesting because there's a huge lake that Taupo, called Lake Taupo, that it sits on. And this lake, in historical times, was a volcano. And it exploded. But this is before Europeans made it to New Zealand. And this enormous lake is what's left, the caldera, after this volcano exploded. And it's immense. I mean, I've been in several calderas, Yellowstone, Ngorongoro in Africa, but this is the biggest that I've ever seen. So we took a boat tour on the lake, and To my surprise, I discovered I didn't have really good pictures of the boat. It was a really nice little, I think it was because it rained that I didn't take. But so we looking out the stern of the boat, and these two people are a British couple. And what we discovered is that he's the owner of a car model that I have just bought. And he and I have actually exchanged emails, and he's helped me become a member of the UK club for that car. It's a modern variant of a Lotus 7 sports car. It's just typical British, very low to the ground, no weather protection, no doors. Kirsten has sat in it once, and she says she'll probably never sit in it again because she had to be lifted out by two of us.
I had a hard time getting out of
The Mercedes.
Yeah. So out on the lake, I included this picture for two reasons. One is you see the size of the lake. You know, you can literally not see the shore on the other side. Now, these are ducks. Yeah, and they have learned to follow the boats and fly up and take food out of your hand. And these ducks were really very persistent. That was kind of cute. We sailed out to an island where there are modern Maori carvings on the rocks. And there are wealthy people in New Zealand, obviously, but not a lot. And you see very, very few expensive cars driving around on the roads. So they're highly privileged. So the next day, we drove a long trip from Taupo down to Wellington, and Wellington is the capital of New Zealand. Excuse me?
Point to where Wellington is.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I know. It's a lot easier for me to read. Yeah. So Taupo here, Wellington there, and we kind of drove down that way. Just outside Taupo, this huge lake drains through a river. And this river really runs, as you can see. And
color true?
it is. The water was completely clear on the lake. Yeah. Gorgeous. I also have a movie of that, but again, I didn't set this up to show movies. And then it ended in a waterfall before the river widened out, and that was also just the volume of water coming through that was impressive. The other thing which is just outside Taupo, is a thermal energy plant. They have lots of geothermal energy there, and they use it. Almost all that electricity comes out of hydroelectric or thermal. So they use very little non-renewable fuels to generate electricity. And of course, New Zealand is in the situation where they have to import an awful lot of stuff, including oil. They have no oil there. So that's another thing. We discovered that where they cut down the forest, either the planted forest, this is European pine forest, that's, they'll grow and they'll cut it down, clear cut it, and then they'll plant again. Every time they do that, these bushes basically leap out of the ground. And they were flowering while we were down there, and it was just really impressive. And they were everywhere.
Wow.
Yeah.
Forsythia?
It's not forsythia. No? They look like forsythia. It's a different plant, but you'd see entire hills completely covered with yellow from these bushes. And of course, I have to show this. Kiwis Crossing. We only had one very dim view of one kiwi, at the bird center I talked about before. They're nocturnal, and they keep them in dark places, and you really have, and they're not easy to spot. And you can see that guy. Yeah. Now, this is not a meal. This is a restaurant. In Wellington, we decided, okay, we're going to go to a real steakhouse instead of a cafe. And we had a really nice meal there. That was good. So, we were at the south end of the North Island, and it was time to sail to the South Island. And what you do is you sail from Wellington to Picton, and that's it's about a 3-hour ferry ride across the Cook Strait. Now, James Cook was the European who landed in New Zealand. There was actually Mr. Tasman, that the Tasman Sea is named after. He saw New Zealand, but he just sailed right by it. So he gets no credit for our discovery. So here we are on the ferry, and this is Wellington. Not a terribly large city, no huge high-rises, that. I'm not a city person, so I won't talk a lot about cities other than about avoiding them. And here we get our first glimpse of the South Island, and what the South Island is well known for is its mountains. There are lots of mountains in the South Island, and you can see they're snow-capped. And then when you get to the South Island, there's a very long inlet that you sail through to get to Picton, where you finally, whoops, we're not quite there yet, just another picture. Oops, sorry, I canned that picture. We'll see it on the way back. So, and then we drove to this place called Nelson, where we spent a couple of nights. The first day in Nelson, we drove this way to a national park where we were taking a boat tour. And on the way, we actually saw these on the North Island. Surrounding some of the fields, they have these humongous hedges. I mean, these are 20, 30 feet tall hedges. How they cut them beats me. And a lot of times they will have this kind of hedge around something that they really don't want to show. A lot of the vineyards had it. Some of the more expensive houses had these kind of hedges. So it's not one where you can tiptoe and peek over the fence to see what's going on. And a tree. My apologies, but that is just so gorgeous.
That's a pine tree.
This, I don't think, I think it is I'm not sure. It may be, the picture isn't sharp enough for me to see. And here we are waiting for the boat, and they had groups of school children that were going out on the same boat as we were. Now, notice, every single kid is wearing a hat for sun exposure. A lot of the kids had bare feet, and they were all in shorts. And these kids were going to take the boat out and hike back through the national park. Now, national parks down there are really nature national parks. It's not like there are a lot of animals that you see like we see here in our national parks. It's mostly walking through nature, trees and rocks and hills and so on. And most of the national parks, there are no roads going into them. There are parking lots around the edges, and you take out your hiking boots and off you go. And you hike. We didn't. Kirsten isn't big on hiking. And I did a tiny little bit of hiking without Kirsten. She's very good because she lets me hike while she waits in the car. So here's the boat that we went out on. And it's funny because they basically run the boats, which are catamarans, all the way up to shore. And this is a ramp that you walk up on. And when they sail away, they raise the ramp up so it sticks up in the air. And, so basically there was no harbor anywhere in this national park. They'll just run these boats into the shore. And a few pictures from the national park, beautiful rock formations. There was an island that had fur seals on it, and you can see here we have a fur seal. I have better fur seal pictures later on in the presentation, but I didn't know at the time that I was going to get better views of them. And here we're getting all the kids off the boat. A few, I don't know how many, probably 10 miles from the town where we started out. And they were really well behaved. And the teachers were, they had control over these kids. There was one kid that sat out right up front with us and got, woof, get in the back. So they are off on the hike. There were some very interesting seabirds. This is a gannet. And I think this is a storm petrel, if we have any birders here. Nope. But this is sort of a tiny bird, seabird, and it just sort of flitters over the water, which is, it looks like it's way too small and fragile to live in that kind of environment. Just incredibly beautiful islands. You can see the tree ferns again. They're just scattered everywhere. Another view, I just love this line of trees with the trunks, bare trunks, and the tight canopy. And here's a rock covered with cormorants. We know what they are. Yeah. Yes. And another island and more trees. Sorry about that. And end of that. So that was that day. Now, this was very interesting. So the next day's trip was from Nelson to Rotorua or something like that. Okay. And
Take your word for it.
it was supposed to be a 4-hour trip. But unfortunately, there was a rockfall right here that, even more unfortunately, had killed a driver. And the road was closed. So actually it was right before this town here. So we thought, we can just drive there, go down there, and it'll take a little bit longer. And when we got here, they said they blocked off the road, and they said, no, you can't get to there from here unless you cross the whole island, you drive down, cross back, and drive up, which we had to do, obviously. So we had, what was it?
7 hours more, so 11-hour drive.
11-hour drive instead of 4. So that was a really long day. But we got to, another thing you should know is that this is pretty much the road network in New Zealand. It's not like there are lots of little roads that are not shown. This is it. So literally, just one little stretch of road being blocked meant that we had to cross over and down and back. So, no picture of New Zealand without sheep. Actually, there are a lot fewer sheep now than when we lived in Australia. So I asked someone, what's going on? And he said, well, the wool market has collapsed. So all that you can do, if you raise sheep, it's for meat. And a lot of these sheep get exported to the Middle East. So there's a lot fewer sheep and more cattle and, the deer that I'll get to. And that's basically that is the main industry of New Zealand, and it's the main export of New Zealand. Yes?
I noticed that the weather is predominantly cloudy, except for a couple of your slides.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because when we saw the forecast before we left, we thought this is going to be a very wet trip, because the forecast was for rain most of the time that we're going to be in New Zealand. It turned out that most of the time it was just cloudy, which was great. And there were places where we saw a lot of sun, but we also saw a few days of rain, but not anything that really bothered us. I'll get to the worst rain that we hit.
Well, it's their winter too, right?
It's spring.
Fall.
It was spring.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, some of the weather is because of the forest fires in Australia.
Yeah, there was a lot of haze.
Some of the smoke came over.
Oh, yeah?
We saw it more towards the end of the trip, but yeah, that had an effect.
Yeah, there were days where I didn't take any pictures because it was so hazy that they would be pretty lousy anyway. And
I want you to know that you have 5 minutes left.
yeah. So we'll rush right along. Lots of wine, which is great. The second biggest industry is road construction and repair. We saw so much unbelievable. The traffic cones were funny because they were this high.
Are
And-
the roads good, Anker? Are they good primarily? Getting around?
Yes, the roads are really well maintained. Some of the repair was basically because they'd had very heavy rains, but there was still more than I've ever seen anywhere else in the world. It was just everywhere. So here we are on the east coast, and it's drier. You can see it's drier than you saw before, because it's in the rain shadow of the mountains. And here we are driving back, and you can see the white-capped mountains, snow-capped mountains, a cafe where we had lunch, and the only picture of a hotel room that I took. The rain is actually pelting down outside, but you can't see it on this picture. It looks nice, doesn't it? But it isn't. Yep. So now we are in this Rapauho, or whatever it was called, town, and we're driving down to a place called Franz Josef. And Franz Josef is where they have a lot of glaciers, thank you, and it's close to the tallest mountain in New Zealand, Mount Cook. And we had reserved a helicopter ride up to the Franz Josef, top of the two main glaciers. And the forecast was really bad, so we were prepared for not being able to do the helicopter tour. So now you can see it's wet on the way down. And we stopped very close to where we left at a place where Kirsten didn't want to venture out because it was wet. These are called pancake rocks for obvious reasons. I haven't seen anything like that anywhere else.
Slate?
No, it wasn't really slate. And this is the same area. So it's the same type of rock, so it's high up. So this is basically a hole in the ground with a natural bridge going out to the ocean. This is a wave crashing in through the natural bridge. I was really happy that I went for that walk, even though it was wet. And here we're more pancake rocks looking out there, and just a beautiful coastline in that area. And here we are at dinner. Sorry, more meals. I had promised no more meals, having dessert. This is funny because I was taking pictures of our meals, and a New Zealander came up, grabbed my camera and said, "You have to have a picture of you two." And Yeah, so this is it. And so now we're down in Franz Josef, and we want to take our helicopter ride, and we can see the tops of the mountains in the morning. And yes, we got on the helicopter, and here we've just taken off. There were 4 people in the helicopter. This lady took the seat I wanted, and then we sat, 3 of us sitting in the back of the helicopter. And here's the Franz Josef Glacier. And we flew up to the top, where now you can see back down the glacier. And we landed on the snow next to the glacier, and Kirsten was able to get out. It was very hard to get in and out of this helicopter. The door was not very wide. And you see, I love this picture because it gives you a sense of scale. When you're up in the mountains, they seem a lot smaller than they are, but this helicopter was just a speck on the hillside covering us, next to us. And without that, you just wouldn't sense how humongous it is. And now here we are on our way back. And one thing I want to show is this piece of land is what's called an end moraine. And this is where the glacier used to end. And you can see the glacier is just a tiny, tiny sliver of it, what it was, not too terribly long ago. So they're losing the glaciers very rapidly. So we were supposed to go to the other glacier, and I've forgotten the name of that, but the Cook Glacier, yes. But it was just too cloudy for them to fly there. This is the Cook Glacier. We drove south, and we were lucky to find a side road which had a lookout where you could look right back at the glacier. Another Cook picture, and now we're down in. We're driving from Franz Josef down to Christchurch. Queenstown, sorry, yeah. Christchurch is here, Queenstown. And the plan was that we would drive out the next day and take a boat tour on one of these fjords that are on the west side of the island. So on the way, we drove to the most remote place in New Zealand. And the road there, this is the road going to the remotest place in New Zealand. And I just loved the way, just thick, thick vegetation around it. And ta-da, here we are, as far away from anybody else we can get in New Zealand. A tiny little fishing village. And now we're driving toward Queenstown, where there was an antique bridge that they had preserved that we stopped at. Again, a one-lane bridge, so it's not a new concept. And again, absolutely fantastic tree forms. This is the wind that shapes these trees. And now, they look familiar, don't they? They are all American elk. That's what they farm down there, and they have huge herds of American elk. And they are raised for meat. Again, venison, you have no trouble getting venison in the restaurants down there. And more mountains, and here's the unfortunate news. We couldn't get to where we were going because in Milford there was an avalanche hazard because it had snowed. The road was closed by snow, so we did not get to take that ferry ride. Instead, we drove around the Christchurch area, and they had some very, very pretty mountains. Here's the picture of cows that I needed to show, and mixed with sheep, more mountains, and it was pretty. It was really pretty. And the next day, from Christchurch over to Dunedin, and the specific goal was to get to the southernmost point in New Zealand, in Invercargill, right here. And here we are, we're not right at the southernmost point. Lighthouse, with lots of waves, lots of windblown trees.
Look at that.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
isn't it? Lots of sheep. Now, I have to show this because even though you can see it's sunny here, there were just constant line of thunderstorms coming through. You can see this thunderstorm here, and there's a thunderstorm right behind it here. So they just had these thunderstorms barreling through. So you'd get a big downpour, sunshine, another big downpour, and lots of wind. So now we're driving up to Christchurch, stopped on the way. This was to a place where they had some caves, and you know, I thought this was a pretty little, we stopped at a place where they had a lighthouse, and there were lots of fur seals. So that's a much better picture of a fur seal. You know, it's similar to a sea lion, but you can see the face doesn't look like the sea lion. And they're all males. They're waiting for the ladies to show up. And so they're all staking out territories, and they were playing in the kelp and having fun and fighting each other for territory. And amazingly tame birds, gulls. Yeah. So we made it to Christchurch, and the next day we're going to drive up to Kaikoura. I have to mention that Prince Charles and Camilla were in Christchurch when we were there, and they were going to visit Kaikoura the day after we stayed there, the night we stayed there. So on the way we saw this weird object. That we absolutely had to take a picture of. And here we are in Kaikoura, a really pretty oceanfront. And when we drove to dinner at night, there was a cop standing, handing out leaflets. And the leaflet said they were going to close the roads because of the Prince Charles and Camilla visit. And we had to make sure that we could get out the next day because we had hotels booked. And we could. Our hotel was far enough out of town that we could get out before Charles showed up. Or Chuck, as some people call him. Chuck and Cam, don't you know them? It turns out that Camilla decided that she didn't want to go to this place. I don't know why Prince Charles came to visit here. You know, basically he came. You know, they did the usual parade, kissing kids and stuff, and then off he went again. This is our hotel. They had a beautiful little courtyard at the hotel. Our room is that one, with the door closed. And this is the center of town. So this is what Charles came to see. And basically it's a row of restaurants, pretty much. So, we're getting to the end. We're doing pretty good. We're getting to the end of the South Island, and we're going to drive back and stop just north of Wellington.
How far is that gap between the two islands?
I would say it's a 3-hour sail in a ferry that's going. Yeah, probably 30, 40 miles. You can see from one side to the other, but that's only because they're mountains. In Picton, they have this ship that is one of the original migration ships that they sent down from England. And it would have been fun to get on board that ship, but the line was incredible. And they only let fairly small groups onto the ship at a time. So instead, we just sat and waited in the car for the ferry to leave. And this is a ferry from the same company, photographed from our ferry going that way. Now, one of the strange things with the ferry we went over from north to south on was you drove onto the ferry and then you had to make a U-turn at the other end of the boat. So because you entered and exited from the same end of the boat, which I haven't seen in a ferry before. A big fish farm in the inlet, and yeah, my apologies, my apologies.
The doctor awaits.
Okay, we're getting there. There's not a lot to go. So from Wellington, North Wellington to New Plymouth, we wanted to see the west coast of the North Island. We stopped in a small town to have breakfast, and this is kind of a typical main street in New Zealand. Love it. And we were driving along, and we saw this great volcano in the and we decided to drive over there. We hadn't read about it in any of the descriptions we'd seen. The New Zealanders are so spoiled. Sometimes we'd be driving along a road, we'd see just a fantastic view, and there'd be no way to stop. They had no pull-offs because, there's so much beautiful stuff in New Zealand that they can't have pull-offs everywhere. And we drove up as far as you can drive along a really narrow drive. You'll see that in a minute. And stopped at a waterfall. I got Kirsten to hike to the waterfall, and this is the road. A couple of trees, places they had trees that they didn't want to cut down, and the road was so narrow that you could barely pass each other, and people were booking, especially downhill on this. There were a couple of cars while we were driving up that almost collided with us. That was scary. And another view of the road. And now we're on our way to Auckland. We wanted to stop at this cafe, but there'd been a death in the family, so we had to eat at a cafe on the other side. Just so rustic. I love the bikes. Here we have more of those stripes where the animals go, more road work. Most of the road work would have, a guard letting you by. And now we're in Auckland, and before the flight, we drove north of Auckland. More nature, another tree, more trees, even more trees. Weird rock that we saw on the beach. And our trip is over, and we're on the plane, and we're looking down at Auckland on our way out. That's it.
Very good.
Thank you. My apologies for going over. Any more questions? Yes?
Where did they film Jurassic Park?
I don't know. Did they do that in New Zealand?
Didn't they?
I don't know.
I thought they did.
I don't know.
Maybe they did.
Okay.
So
That film that was done in Hawaii, I think.
Were the temperatures
Yeah.
much different as you got to the south end of the South Island?
yes,
You mentioned the wind earlier.
yes, and it did get cooler, but it warmed up. The temperature was very variable, and of course we also had altitude issues where, as soon as we got to any kind of altitude, it would cool off quite a lot. But it was never what I'd call cold. A windbreaker and a fleece was all that you really needed.
I just noticed from the photos you're showing anyway, very little commercialism.
Yes.
You don't see a Walmart or anything. It's just beautiful.
Oh yeah. Actually.
The buildings.
Oh yeah, and you really had to plan to stop at a supermarket because the little towns would not have any kind of supermarket, so you'd have to shop. in the big stores, I was missing a little piece for my tripod for my camera, and I thought, you know, in one of the large cities, I could stop at a photo shop and buy them, and they just didn't have them. And you see, you haven't seen any factories on any of these. They have very, very little manufacturing going on. It's a little scary because the economy is so dependent on the exports that they have of livestock.
What's the best time of the year to see the place?
Maybe a little later than what we did. The winter really does get cool. You know, it's roughly on the same latitude as we are here, but southern. So we're 43 degrees, aren't we? Chris would know that.
42.
42. We're 40, and you know the southern tip of New Zealand is right around 40. So, and of course they have they're surrounded by seas, which keeps the temperatures moderate. I think what you really want to avoid is the really, really wet seasons, which I think the wet season is in November, but I'm not sure. I can't remember.
The pictures are unbelievably beautiful.
Sue,
Is it hard, anywhere you look, you've got,
oh yes, yes.
I've never seen anything like this.
Oh,
I have no idea.
thank you. No, I would, you know, it's a great country to visit. You're reminding me of something that I wanted to say, which is, I think the only way to really see the country is to drive yourself around. And it takes a lot of driving, but the New Zealanders are really, really very considerate drivers. To my surprise, most of them drive at or under the speed limit. I don't know many countries where that's the case. I never saw anything approaching road rage or somebody who is. I shouldn't brag about this, but I was passed by 3 or 4 cars in the entire trip.
So no traffic lights per se? I didn't see traffic lights? I mean,
No.
or I just missed
No,
Just
no.
like the bridges when you go over there.
Yes, right, and in the cities. Now, a third of the population of New Zealand lives in Auckland. And to me, I shouldn't say this on TV, but I think cities often are just hellholes, are just unattractive places. So we just avoided the cities. They have stoplights there. Anyone? Well, thank you for your patience, and I hope this was somewhat interesting.
It was.
Keep traveling.
Thank you.
We will thank you.